Welcome to the final presentation and review of Emily Phagoo's thesis, Milestone. Her thesis title is called Boundary Making in Architecture. Her supervisor is John Cirka, and second reader is Arthur Wrigglesworth. We have two external reviewers joining us today. The first is Stephanie Davidson from Ryerson School of Interior Design, and Maya Orzechowska from the Studio of Contemporary Architecture, and I'm the program rep, and my name is Bill Galloway. We're all familiar with this, I suppose, but just for the sake of formality, Emily, you have 20 minutes to do your presentation, and then we'll have discussion for 30 minutes or a bit more perhaps, after which time you'll be asked to excuse yourself, and then we'll have a deliberation, after which time you will be contacted by John. So I give the floor to you.
Thank you, everyone. For the duration of the presentation, I'll be turning my camera off, but for the discussion, I'll put it back on. Boundary making is a conscious act which initiates the creation of architecture. The necessity to divide, assemble, and control our surroundings is inherent to the development of the way we occupy space. Acting on our phenomenological experience of existing distinctions, boundaries are used both to support and mark out. It has over time become a sort of prescription for the creation of architecture. Boundary is materialized through architecture. However, this is misinterpreted as boundary being something physical or of absolute certainty. Boundary is not so determinate and can manifest in many forms. These forms, within the context of this thesis, include the following. The common or initial assumption of boundary is that its existence hinges solely in the form of binaries. The difference we know as inside and outside is an example of this, just as with the self and the other. The liminal boundary is where the boundary begins to unveil its complex nature. Though it might not be deliberately exposed, it exists as alterity or the known sense of otherness. With the example of the binary of black and white, there exist innumerable shades of grays that fall in between the two, not a distinct marking, but the subtle transition between them. The change of state is made known eventually by outside physical factors that mark it. Being aware of boundaries as not something rigid, but maybe liminal in nature, marks a threshold from one thing to another. The boundary as threshold is the demarcation of this transgression. Though architecture may be seen as a series of decisiveness and order, one of the most fundamental acts of architecture, boundary making, is inherently uncertain. Boundary is not simply a border between one thing to the next. Embracing and encouraging the inevitable uncertainties, instability, abstraction, and indeterminacies that come with the use of boundary-making devices can achieve sublime results. This is not to cast doubt on the tools we use to create architecture, but rather to understand that there is indistinction within distinction, and boundary is a passage or a space and not always a barrier. Within Boundary House, every boundary and device was allowed to interact freely, producing uncertain outcomes from certain inputs. Boundary making can be maximized as its credibility while not trying to hide possible tangential outcomes that may arise. The house in architecture is a pure form to explore boundary making as layers generated beyond the human body, which are made distinguishable on a phenomenological basis. The house is the primary extension as well as an imitation of the boundaries that exist within oneself, from socio-psychological tendencies to inherent biological attributes. The physical human body has served as a starting point to create an order of proportion, scale, and symmetry within space. The human body offers examples of boundaries which are more universally understandable and applicable than the uomo universale, and without the reliance on mathematical perfection. Measuring and replicating proportions of ideal, selected, human, male figures, concretizing the connection with numerics, will not necessarily achieve the ideal human dwelling outside of their own skin. Le Corbusier argues the prosthetics theory and states that, like the barrel of Diogenes, our body is a primordial cell of a house, with our organs as skin and scalp, and cabinets and wardrobes containers for our needs. The house is an extension of the human body, not by translating each organ into an architectural element, but has already been done through humans' inherent knowledge of themselves. Diogenes' barrel may well be his physical shelter, as it separates him from the open air of the public, but would be an oversimplification to see this as simply a binary division from himself to the other. It is an illustration of the complexities found in one of the most fundamental human boundaries, the public and private. As we are welcome to peer into St. Jerome's study, there is the same sense of shelter, but also far beyond the primordial cell and into the depth of interiority, of domesticity, and of privacy. The barrel is the fact that though our boundary making of even public and private were already established, our sense of interiority before actually entering the building or shelter or cabinet or wardrobe has already been established. The notion of interiority, which automatically presumes an exteriority, is applied to all scales, even into the innermost object within St. Jerome's desk and St. Jerome himself. Now we find ourselves enclosed within walls, an interiority but still set apart from the space beyond. We are introduced to a boundary of a binary, inside the enclosure but outside the space beyond. Even here, the terms can be interchanged seamlessly. Outside the original enclosure, but inside another, we have a better grasp on the space in which we once were contained. Like Marshall McLuhan's invisible environment, the realization of a former state is only realized once the environment has been passed, and that we have now moved on to another environment. A change occurred, now evident by the familiarity of the light which we now know to be from a window. Again, we are shifted to an outer interior. Our sense of exclusivity between exteriority and interiority is challenged. What was seemingly once evident as a binary difference is increasingly elusive as we are set in a room looking at the tiny containment on a shelf that was once our whole world. From here, we have a glimpse both above and below, still unsure of what's to come. Outside the room into the doorway. Exiting the room, the familiar light is seen again by looking through the threshold that we have traversed. Boundaries do not dictate the passage, but are produced in the process of passage. The movement defines the boundary. This illustration provides the break in the idea that a boundary might be a wall or a barrier, but can note this place as liminal or marking a threshold. This journey through Boundary House embraces the uncertainty of our perception of boundaries. Stairs are an indicator of a gradient in both the horizontal and vertical planes. The boundary as gradient is also aware of the process of transition from one thing to the next, a subtle representation of liminal transition between this and that, unlike the boundary as a representation of tension. Navigating through the liminality of a corridor and moving back and forth, while simultaneously going up and down, one direction comes with the other. The vertical corridor, still unsure of what is next due to the obstruction of turning a corner, but certain of the gradient change in elevation. Following the light, we are given a view of exteriority through this threshold. The vertical corridor leads to another room, which hangs off its structure. Into the second room, through a transition of light, we reach again a new sense of exteriority as we can see into the shadowy space which we came from. The hallway to this room was a gradual introduction to light and the existence of a level below. Across from the room, we can see that the room was relatively enclosed. Another change in elevation is required to access the level below. Stepping back inside from the exterior rooms, the darkness is disorienting to the eyes. Following the geometry of the stair, familiar in shape but indeterminate of the tangential destination. Traveling along archways, but not through it, expresses the option of the boundary threshold. The threshold means the existence of limitation as well as the possibility of freedom. Passing through, rather than along the archways, lead to a framed enclosure. Moving out and seeing the house as an object hints to how the space was determined and how it was constructed. And back into the house. Layering and repetition solidifies certain boundaries as well as grades of enclosures. The complexity of boundaries is evident in the visual perceptions of spaces as well as the choices to navigate them. The foyer is shrouded in hard divisions as well as abstracted ones. A binary marking is made by the cut of shadows, without a physical interruption. The entrance to Boundary House welcomes us through the doorway. The gradient is the approach to the door by following the geometry of the frame and canopy. And here we see a drawing of the same space by tracing the canopy and the frame to an eventual vanishing point which leads back into the depth of the house. The vanishing point expresses a limit, and in the context of a drawing, a limit which is surpassed to portray a depth of space visually on a plane that cannot be reached physically. We are invited into a drawing and made to pass this threshold in order to make sense of it spatially. The goal of the sublime is to push limits, and what we witness or feel is the tension of this rebellion. The appearance of the sublime is grounded in indeterminacy. It is pleasure mixed with pain, pleasure that comes from pain. Acknowledging that boundary is transgressive makes sense of this apparent contradiction, as it is not a contradiction to encounter multiple realities at once. The existence of or placement of a boundary is not solely designed to separate, but also proves there is a connection among varying entities. To reiterate, this is a different limit to be transgressed as a boundary. Typically, our bodies conform to certain limits. spatially for example, but may surpass other, such as age. Foucault states, quote, "The limit and transgression depend on each other for whatever density of being they possess. A limit could not exist if it were absolutely uncrossable, and reciprocally, transgression would be pointless if it were merely crossed a limit composed of illusions and shadows." Unquote. This identity of reaching up to a limit, yes, also the terrifying or beautiful possibility of transgression of a boundary, is sublimity. It is beyond architecture to influence the outcome of boundary making. However, architecture is a facility in which accepting the boundary as imperfect leads to its transcendence. The wall, the line, and boundary are all capable of expressing sublimity once they are released from our functional understanding and use. Just as much as an opening can change a wall into a threshold, the expression of a boundary in architecture as transgressive and complex can lead to an architecture of revelations and secrets, allowing oppositions to go indistinct and thrive as sublimity does, a boundary unbound. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Emily. So I guess we can start, before we get into comments, we can see if there's any questions of clarification. Shall we start with the guests? Either Stephanie or Maya?
No, I don't think there's anything for clarifications on my side necessarily.
Okay. How about you, Stephanie? Do you have any questions?
I guess in reading through your document, I was interested in how you placed an emphasis or a focus in your drawing on the perspective, rather than other views that I think in my mind could have furthered your agenda or helped support your thesis, like an oblique. I'm just wondering what led you to focus in on the perspective beyond the point about the vanishing point being kind of indistinct or infinite. Were there any considerations, or did you try out other views to support your thesis in your representation?
Yeah, I did use some other drawings, but what was interesting about perspective and why I kind of, in the initial process, why I kind of followed that path is because starting off with perception, a lot of times when we draw in perspective, it's to try to understand how we would perceive that space. And perspective drawing is typically, though it's not always that close to reality, allows us to kind of engage with our surroundings differently, or the approach. And I think the approach is very important when it comes to boundary from one thing to the next, or transitions. And that's when we really encounter boundary head on, is in the approach. And that's why I think perspective shows that in a more heavy way than some other types of drawings.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I guess I saw you on the cusp, maybe this is more of a comment, but on the cusp of wanting to critique drawing practices. There was mention of convention, but it seems like you were more leveraging how you had learned drawing conventions, as I understand it through your explanation. So thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Arthur or John, do you have questions, clarification?
Maybe I can follow from that a bit. That there was, it seemed that most of your drawings were were perspectival and of a sense of kind of an immersive reality that you were representing to us. And then towards the end, when there was a cube with distorted image behind it, looking like radiating lines, kind of, it seemed that was different sort of drawing, or you were trying to present some different order of ideas to us in that. I don't know if you can go to that drawing. Can you just maybe, yes, that one. Can you confirm for me whether there is an actual break in the representational language at this point, or were there others as well?
Yeah, I think
And kind of what was the role of this change in your discourse that you were laying out?
right. Yeah, I guess earlier on there was a break when you sort of zoom out of the house from
Mm-hmm.
this view to this one.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the same drawing. It's still the same type, but we come to realize that there's more to what's in the frame, and sort of like how the painting of Saint Jerome works, where there's always this other level of interiority or exteriority that we're not privileged to know about, depending on the frame that's given to you. And then moving outward into this frame, I guess it's the distortion of where we were, where because the journey begins within this cube, and then once we leave it, we're constantly discovering what our sense, or constantly questioning our sense of interiority and exteriority, until it's kind of like the planes don't really, not don't matter, but the planes don't really have to correspond to our exact like field of vision. So that's really where this sort of drawing comes up.
So did you just say this image is outside of the image that you just flipped from?
No, that was for that was from this one to this one. But the journey began inside of, in this image, we begin inside of the cube.
Yes, but that image with the cube and the distorted imagery around it, I'm trying to understand its role and the visual language you're deploying. What is the discourse you're trying to present in that
Okay.
in that particular drawing?
I guess and for this one, just that
Yeah.
that's where we're kind of, once we kind of go through all the challenges of discovering where we fit into this box and into the house, outside of that, the distortion is to show that it's not exactly distinctive, and that this is what leads to the sublime outcomes, is that the indistinction can lead to it. So that's what the distortion.
Okay. Thanks.
Since we're on a discussion of drawing types and what they might indicate for us, I'd like to go to another axonometric view of this box, which is that also the one that also has the fold out of the 6 planes. Can you jump to that one? So there's another one. I mean, there's perspective certainly within these. And so, yes, I mean, I think Stephanie's point is correct that it's a very dominant form. But I think in the context that Arthur raised of asking questions about different ways of understanding and perhaps breaks in discourse, I would point to this image as well. It's not explicitly articulated by Emily in the presentation, but I think we could begin to follow that thread of inquiry. And next, Emily, could you jump to that kind of perspectival elevation that you've flipped through recently? Yeah, that one. And I like to remark here that there's this is a tricky drawing because yes, we can read it as if it has perspective in it, because there are things that go to a vanishing point that's very clearly marked here with a little tiny circle. But it could also be read as simply a flat elevation that happens to include some forms that may represent rectangles distorted in perspective, but they could also be seen as odd shapes of trapezoids and so on. So I think that there's more complexity than simply following a thread of perspective in here. But I think that it is a very dominant form for Emily because she's really and correct me if I'm wrong, Emily, but I feel that certainly within this presentation there has been a very strong thread of an immersive journey through this, as you call it, a boundary house.
Yeah, that's correct.
I also had a question that came to my mind when you were presenting this drawing. The way I scribbled it down, it was some of what you said was revealing how it was constructed. I think you said something about that sort of thing, and I'm wondering, in a way, the way I was hearing your words, it seems to be not in congruence with what John has just suggested. And I was wondering what is revealed and what value does this revealing do for you? And it seemed that what you were trying to say was that while there's mystery and partial understanding available to you as you navigate from within to without, this is in a sense, it seemed to be the ultimate outside that gave this privileged perspective onto the design. I was curious as to, on one hand, I actually I like John's version better than my version, but I'm trying to understand what the purpose of this particular drawing was to your discourse. Like, why did you need to come all the way out? And why was it important to reveal whatever it was you were saying you were revealing at this moment?
Right. Well, being inside the house, like I said before, it's supposed to challenge your ideas of what's inside, what's outside through these different boundaries that we're experiencing, either as or threshold, or like the options that we have with threshold, or the liminality that comes with these transitions. And with this one, I wouldn't say that it's exclusively outside or exclusively the end of the drawing or the end of the view of the house, because up until this point, we're supposed to be moving through the house in a way where all of that is in question, and we can see how everything was put together here in a construction, but even still it goes, there's a vanishing point, but there's still some uncertainty in how it is actually how it's actually transpired, like with the different forms and the vanishing point, and without being a direct elevation or without being a direct perspective.
But this is the one drawing that we have white space surrounding all of the object. I think every other drawing there is the idea of object beyond the frame that you've set, and I think you spoke about that kind of thing. The talking about things, I was interpreting a scale and the point of view or position of the viewer relative to the space or the objects that, and this is the one time where it seems that you're saying there isn't anything more beyond the white, or would you suggest that there actually needs to be something beyond, that you could keep zooming out or moving away? And is that even irrelevant to your discourse?
It's relevant in the sense that I was looking at it in terms of sort of like a scalar approach, a scalar geometry approach, or it's continuous in the sense where it keeps going in and out, or you're not sure where it's in and out. But for this one, yes, you're correct. This and the other one is the only one with the white space surrounding it.
Oh, right. Okay.
This is just to have you realize what was there before. Using the example of like the Marshall McLuhan invisible environments, once we've passed it, then we know. So this
I
is
see.
what these drawings are really meant to emphasize.
Okay, that's great. You looped it back to the Marshall McLuhan piece. Okay, thank you.
And that form of argument of not realizing it until after the fact is very much his McLuhan's discussion of Aristotle's formal cause, which I think he's one of the few writers and thinkers who actually even dare to decipher Aristotle's formal cause. Everybody else touches on the three others and basically leave the formal cause behind. So I think it's quite interesting because it is dealing with form basically. With more so with the other image rather than this one, because this one I think you really set it up as a kind of other view of the entry. That's where it sits within your sequence here. But the other one, the way that I'm kind of problematizing it, and to come back to or problematizing its reading, and to come back to again to Arthur's questions around this. If we see this as a perspective construction of a potential physical space, physical object, architectural object, then yes, we understand it, that we're very much positioned outside of it. But I could also see this in a way that we're totally immersed in it if we read it as a mental map of our understanding of the house. So, that's how I feel that this is very immersive, and I'm not bothered by the white space. I'm attracted by that thing that I'm trying to understand, or I am in the midst of trying to understand within Emily's presentation.
Regard, actually, it makes me think a little bit. One of the things I noticed when I was looking through your work and reading your document, Emily, is kind of your mark making, which I think is quite intriguing. And I think the way that some of that almost looks scratched in, or almost like we say architecture is a system of writing, but some of it almost looks like it has this sort of written or I don't know, like almost like a hieroglyph or something type of character to it. And I think I was wondering, in your sort of, clearly you've looked at Plato and forms, and just sort of how those things sort of figure together. And there's something that seems a little bit cave-like here. And I think I was just wondering whether there's something in your process that you haven't explicitly told us, but that you kind of might be able to share in how you've been thinking through making these drawings.
Yeah, I guess that was actually one of the challenges at the beginning, is going from mark making to boundary making and trying to understand the connections that those have and also the differences. And that's why it was actually important that though I'm making a mark, or that I'm creating something, I'm giving it geometry, I'm giving a room a space to kind of end and begin a new one. It was important that the mark making doesn't become confused with boundary making, and that the boundary could still be seen as something indistinct or something more elusive, or maybe even ambiguous at that point, and that a marking is something that it's almost like a residual effect, or it might be just even an initial, but boundary making really takes over, and those types and the forms that we perceive them in is what was more important to show in this house.
Great. Shall we move to some commentary, perhaps? I don't know where the boundary ever is, to be honest. But
Yeah, I think we have. I think we're beyond the clarification.
well, do you want to start with the comments then, John?
No, not really. I would like to continue with Maya's connection, to particularly between the sort of atmosphere of the hand drawings, which we didn't see too much of here in this presentation, but it certainly has been a very important part of Emily's process in getting to her conclusion in her thesis and this project as well. And I'm not sure if Emily is if Maya is making a connection between the atmosphere of the cave and that strange light that filters in. I see the connection because of with working with Emily and her kind of struggle with, as she called it at one point, uncertainty that was kind of declared as the kind of main feature of her thesis. And I connect that to another aspect of Plato's cave, which is that light that is meant to represent the clarity of actually understanding, and perhaps dispelling at least some of the confusion and uncertainty that we have in facing the world. So, I appreciate that connection, Maya. I read it in that particular way, which I'm not sure if you were suggesting that or if it was that kind of atmospheric connection to the way that Emily produced a lot of her earlier hand-drawn work.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both, actually. And there felt like there was something that was sort of occurring on multiple levels in a very nice way.
Emily, in your document, you had an image of a Turner painting, and I think that showed up as the background or somehow incorporated into one of the drawings that I saw this afternoon. Maybe near okay, yeah, here. Was that near the beginning of your presentation, or?
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit because I think in your document you were associating that painting with the discussion about the sublime. Can you talk a bit maybe about what John and Maya have raised with regards to this, or maybe just talk about the role of that particular image or that painting in how you're co-opting it? I know you've used imagery of other sorts along the way, but how is that playing in now?
Well, so the sublime is really the conclusion I come to, is that through all the uncertainties and the fact that sublime quite literally or etymologically means leading up to a limit, and boundary can also be seen in the same way. And if we don't look at it as a limit, as we look at it surpassing a limit, then we can understand how we can achieve these kind of sublime results or atmospheres. Mm-hmm. And so putting it in the beginning was really to solidify the fact that boundary is not just a binary, and it could be liminal, it can be a gradient, it could be threshold, and that these things together or separate or
mm-hmm.
however they interact could lead to sublime outcomes. Because one of the greatest mysteries in literature and art is just how does sublime work? How do we achieve it? how does it come to be, and how can we have all these contradictions exist within one? And I think having that at the beginning is just to kind of open the discussion on these contradictions not actually being impossible.
I think in a way, this might also tie in a little bit to why I was reading something Cave and a little Plato into some of your mark making as well, because he's a bit of a controversial figure, but Georges Bataille wrote something about line making and marks. And in it, he talks about limits as well, and limits that have to do with death and sexuality. And so I think this kind of idea of sublime and this kind of fear of pleasure, I think I'm reading that a little bit in as well. And I really like the way you've used the sublime in your work. There's something kind of very, yeah, almost like inspirational and hopeful in it. And I think that's really nice.
Thank you.
Stephanie, were you going to say something?
I think it connects to Maya's comment maybe in a way. I also really enjoy how your thesis topic addresses this kind of ever-present condition, the boundary, and celebrates its complexity. I applaud the kind of terrain that you lay out in your document in terms of references like Rob Shields and Michel Foucault, a lot of others, also architects like Carlos Scarpa. And I really enjoy, similar to how Maya was describing how your own personal spatial or design project is highly abstract and remains abstract. It's kind of like space for space sake, trying to get to the core of spatial or perceptual questions, as you say, that are transcendent of function. So I really applaud that, because I feel there's often a kind of sense of obligation to address a whole bag of aspects or attributes in an architectural thesis that you sidestep quite successfully. A few comments, maybe to broaden your thinking about the theme. I'm surprised that the topic of composition didn't appear to come up in your discussion of geometry and shapes, with more contemporary references, like, for example, Fala Atelier is an obvious one for me. Your document is rich with kind of classical references, but I think that actually your topic is like topical. I think that in contemporary discourse, which I think is quite a buzz right now, you could have found a lot of work that resonates with you, I'm imagining. And the topic of composition, for example, the relationships between forms and space, or forms and form, could have expanded your vocabulary also in your narration, walking us through your house or spatial composition. That was my hunch, like just listening to your words, since they're so under the microscope in a thesis. I felt like that whole topic of conversation comes with its own vocabulary, which was just like behind the surface for you as we were moving through your space. Another topic, the body, tied so closely when you bring up phenomenology, which figures prominently in your document. So when you reference the body, singularizing the body perhaps cuts you off from complex territory that supports your thesis again about a contradictory boundary condition. Let's say the window with curtains that separates pedestrians from sex workers in Amsterdam. Something like that. Our bodies you also used, but that's also singularizing a physical condition, which is in fact so incredibly rich and varied, right? Final comment, the main sort of meat of your presentation, moving through your house, or let's call it spatial composition, your project. There's an assumption about a certain basic level of agency a person has when encountering or experiencing boundaries in the situation that you set up. And again, I think that it would have been rich to interrogate that, or to at least recognize and acknowledge that in your abstract realm, there is no sex, no gender, no hierarchy. Women are not afraid at night. Do you know what I mean? It's just a free flow of space. So I think because when you reference something like the ontological boundary of Rob Shields, it's planted right in that matrix or graph in your document that boundaries are associated with agency and with danger, right? With immigration. So I think that, and that is core to why boundaries exist, to keep some people out, often, to keep others safe. So that is perhaps a little bit of an underdeveloped potential, but maybe it's just not your interest, which I also respect. I just wanted to bring it up because for me, that would have been an interesting kind of, I guess, path or aspect to flesh out.
Great, thank you.
Marco, did you want to say something?
There's been a pretty substantial discussion already on a lot of these points. The one thing that maybe I would ask, and it's not so much a question as maybe a bit of a suggestion. If I'm remembering correctly, that your reference to the sublime really just came up towards the end of the presentation, right? When you actually talked about it. And I have to confess, at a certain point in the presentation, I got called away very briefly, so I may have missed something in what you were saying. But I just kind of had a quick look in your document, and I just wanted to say that if you are really interested in this question of the sublime and you want to pursue that, I would strongly suggest, and you may have done it, but it's not recorded in your document, suggest looking at Edmund Burke and the kind of foundational literature on the philosophical foundations of the sublime. So I think it's a really fascinating moment, and it basically is one of the foundational ideas that led to the whole Romantic movement and the idea of Romanticism, which for me is a really rich discourse. And I think if you talk about the sublime, it would, if you really want to pursue that kind of avenue, I would look at some of that foundational literature as well.
Yeah. There's a couple of traditions that are perhaps related, but also quite distinct. And the other historical reference point for the sublime is the Kantian version. And so that doesn't necessarily lead to, there's a certain romantic quality to it, but not as a strong a connection. So there are many points of entry, and of course, extension as well in contemporary discussions.
Can I actually ask a question of you, Stephanie? You mentioned Fala. I'm wondering if you're talking about them because of they connect their work to Instagram and this new medium and things like that quite often. Are you thinking about medium when you're talking about Fala, or is there something else that you have in mind?
I think that I'm looking at like the context of the work that Emily, you produced. And I think that that sort of shutting the door to contemporary critical practice is missing out, because if Emily were to reach out to Fala, maybe they're reading the same things as you are, Emily, or Point Supreme in Greece. Mm-hmm. There is like a contemporary discourse that is actually interested in similar kind of core spatial questions, which is one reason that I enjoy your thesis so much. But the funny thing is, it's like happening it's happening in the built environment. It's happening concretely, but you see a level of abstraction that you're kind of aiming for realized. And it's kind of, it's very provocative. It's very deliberate. And so I think there's terrain for Emily to mine and work being done that would resonate very, very much. So it's just an opportunity to find, a link to kind of critical practice, which isn't removed at all from academia. All of these practitioners also teach So it's really bound to questioning and to references for sure.
Right, great, thank you. So we have a little under 10 minutes left. Are there any more comments?
Maybe just picking up a little bit on what Stephanie said about different types of bodies moving through space and moving through space. I feel like there's a sense of kind of like almost acceleration and deceleration in your project, just both in how you speak and pause. And then some of the imagery also gives us this sort of, I guess, almost sense of speed, but still. And so I think I was just wondering if you thought how you were thinking about those things, if you were thinking about those things consciously as you were developing your work with relationship to boundary, because obviously, sort of as Stephanie was saying, there's sort of an agency in approaching a boundary. And I think that's not just maybe a physical body experience, but it could also be seen as, I think there's been a lot of research recently on various conditions such as Parkinson's, et cetera, where people are experiencing something sped up or slowed down. And so how they're experiencing that boundary might also be a different experience as well. And I just think there's something interesting in looking at your project from those kind of different modes, bring something kind of rich to it as well.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I hadn't crossed my mind in terms of especially what you're saying with Parkinson's. That would be definitely something to look into, and I think that would pique my interest, because something that I wanted to look at more in depth would have been the idea of time and marking time and passing time. These are things that also come into play when you talk about boundary, especially with liminal. And I think, yeah, the speed and the slowness, that would definitely, I think, be an interesting avenue to kind of like spin off of this.
Cool. If there's no more comments, and maybe we can wrap up with really final statements, not to put everyone on the spot again. If you already said everything, there's no pressure, but perhaps you want to say something, Arthur?
I've really enjoyed this line of inquiry over the past year, and I think it's very interesting for me to see at this time of kind of wrapping up your work that what you've seemed to have done is opened, certainly in the case of this discussion, opened lots of doors of where this work, you could take it, you could continue to take it, could have taken it. And so this is, to my ears, not so much at talking about limitations, but opportunities. So I think you've set up a very rich discourse that certainly has me continuing to think about these ideas. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for the opportunity to engage with you with these ideas. And as Arthur has just said, and as we've heard a number of suggestions today, the work can continue in many other directions, and hopefully that's something that you will pursue. I think it's been an interesting year to grapple with these ideas in the context of architecture, and of course there's a lot more to explore and develop. So thanks, Emily. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Thanks. Maya and Stephanie, do you have anything, final statements?
I was just going to say, I feel like it's interesting to see work that's touching on similar areas, I think, as my own work at the beginning of the pandemic. And when I think back on my own work, it was sort of, I think there was a sadness to it. And it's really nice to see sort of, I think, coming closer to an end of a pandemic, maybe, work that's on similar subject matter, but it seems much more hopeful. So I think this has been kind of nice conversation for me from that aspect as well. So hopefully leave you with positive thoughts.
No, just from me, I really enjoyed it. Certainly was waiting for that narration that you provided, because I was so intrigued in the end with what you assembled as your spatial composition. No glazing, highly abstract. And I really appreciate a kind of rigor, at the same time using restraint and maintaining a kind of key abstraction as you address these like ever-present issues that I'm sure will kind of like dog you and continue to bite at your brain as you enter this. Congrats.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mark, you've probably said everything, but if you have anything you want to add, I suppose now's the best time.
No, I think this is a good place to leave it. With that, I'll just say thank you, Emily, and congratulations. And we will now ask you to please leave the meeting. I'm going to stop the live stream and stop the recording, and then we'll deliberate as a committee. And John will get back to you with a debrief of what we talked about. Okay.
Thank you. I
Great,
just want to
thank
say thank you everyone for the discussion. It was inspiring actually, and to push some thoughts forward, and it's exciting all the different ways that it can go. Thank you.